think it is very important to look back at some of the research literature in psychology, because there are many important pieces of information in the old studies in psychology that may help us understand human behavior right now, and especially the behavior that is shown or that is demonstrated by the mainstream media and also by political leaders. And I'm a bit reluctant to call these people leaders, because that time is running out. The study I will talk about is, the title of the study I will talk about is the behavioral study of obedience by Milgram, and it was published in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology in 1963. If you want to look it up, it is in volume 67, number 4, page 371 to 78. I have the definition of obedience from a Dictionary of Psychology by Ray Corsini. It's the edition from 2002. And you can find the definition on page 655. They define obedience as compliance, particularly as carried out in response to direct command. So in a sense, obedience means submitting to the orders of an authority. And also we can also say that obedience can be enforced through disciplinary means, such as through the implementation of new laws to regulate a societal unit. Going back to the experiment, specifically, Milgram wanted to investigate whether Germans have some inbuilt flaw in terms of how they think and behave. So such a flaw would make them more prone to act in accordance with authority. And the results of the preliminary study conducted in the US successfully demonstrated that it is not the German character that is responsible for obedient behavior. And you can find this information specifically also not only in Milgram's study, but also in Gross 1999. You can find this information specifically in a book called Key Studies in Psychology, 3rd edition by Richard Gross. I have the edition from 1999. A very good book listing a number of very important studies in psychology. So looking at the important pieces of information, including the variables in the study. Let's talk about the variables in this experiment. But first of all, for people who do not know what a variable is in terms of psychology experiments or experiments in the sciences or in the social sciences, a variable is anything that can vary. So, for example, behavior that varies in response to the influence of another factor. So the dependent variable in Milgram's study is the behavior of the participant, specifically the degree to which the subject continues to administer electric shocks to another person until he is no longer willing to go on with the experiment. Of course, the person receiving the electric shocks was an actor. The independent variable is basically the factor in an experimental design that causes a shift in the dependent variable or has an effect on the dependent variable. And in Milgram's study, the independent variable is the experimenter's instructions to the participants so that they continue with the task. Some brief information on the participants. As far as I remember, they were from different occupational backgrounds. All of them were male. 40 male participants took part in the study, and they were all between 20 and 50 years of age. I have to say, this is a relatively short summary of the experiment. I could easily talk about more of the details, the experimental details, but I leave that out to include some of the more important pieces of information and to make this video a bit more interesting, especially in the context we are facing right now. So the next point, the procedure, is very important. Generally speaking, the experimenter was the person overseeing the experiment. The person receiving the shocks was an actor who was called the learner in this MILGRIM'S study, and the participants were all assigned the role of teacher, those who were administering the shocks. And the subjects were told that the experiment was about investigating how punishment affects learning. The subjects were told that the electric shocks would cause a lot of pain in the learner without any danger for long-term effects. So this is an important point. And I have to add here I have to add my own information here. I try to stick to the original information of the study, so I do not alter it in any form. I just give you a summary of the information, but here and there I throw in my own thoughts, throw in my own interpretations and some very valuable insights, I think, that I will pass on to you. So I have to add that this is actually a very important step in the process of testing obedience. So the subject were told that the electric shocks would cause a lot of pain in the learner without any danger for long-term effects. I think it's a very important step in the process of testing obedience, because the participants would have to blend out their own perceptions about what effect the shock might have on the subjects. And they would also have to ignore feelings of compassion, at least to a certain extent. And it is exactly the type of behavior we would witness in situations when someone blindly follows orders. So the order needs to be executed despite being aware of the fact that it will cause a certain degree of harm. So telling the subject that a procedure will have no long-lasting adverse effects on the participant requires an individual, so I think that requires an individual with a mindset that enables him to always think about the overall objective of the operation, while at the same time blocking out any intruding thoughts, for example, strong feelings of compassion that might potentially lead the subject to stop participating. So this is my own added piece of information here. We'll go on with the study. The task was a word matching task. I think they called it word matching task. The subject was the so-called teacher, so the one who administered the electric shocks. And that subject reads aloud a list of words, and the confederate, this is the actor, sitting in that room, tied to a chair. He had to choose the correct word out of 4 that fitted with a test item that he was presented with. So the electrical shocks were supposed to be administered for every wrong answer, and the intensity of the electrical shock was increased with every incorrect response. The so-called teacher also needed to verbally state, and this is quite an interesting point, the so-called teacher also needed to state the level, or announce the level of electric shock he would use. And Milgram describes this procedural element as a way to make the teacher specifically aware of the fact that the electrical shock level was increased. So I have to add that we could also say that they clearly knew what they were doing. So thinking about the possible consequences of their behavior in the context of increasing the level of electricity would have probably resulted in a failure to participate in the experiment. Some information on the learner. The learner was the one who was tied to a chair in the other room. He was labeled as the confederate or the actor, so the person who knew what was going on. And the learner was specifically trained to act in a particular way when receiving the electrical shocks. And Milgram designed the experiment in such a way that the actor did not show a clear indication of the severe effects of the shocks until the subject was willing to administer 300 volts to the actor. Yeah, this is quite remarkable. This was the point where loud noises could be heard from the room where the victim was tied to the chair. So we can throw in some additional piece of information here. It clearly shows that as long as people accept punishment without protest, the people who are manipulated to put into practice forms of punishment and oppressive measures to society will continue to follow the orders without questioning. So after a certain shock level, and in this case that was 315 volts, no noise was heard from the actor. Milgram employed, this is also a very important piece of information. Milgram employed, this is basically the independent variable. Milgram employed 4 prods in the experiment, which pressed the subject or led the subject to continue with the operation. And these prods differed in terms of the directness of the command to continue. So if the subject was reluctant to continue after receiving the first prod, the second prod increased the intensity of the command. And yeah, if we think about it, this mirrors the influence of a powerful entity that makes use of its position of authority to guide those who have lost their own will and instead look up to this entity for orders. And the subjects were then classified as being defiant or obedient based on how subjects accepted the orders. Let's talk briefly about the results of the study and some final remarks by myself. After the experiment, the participants were interviewed to see, for example, if they were aware of the level of intensity of the shocks they administered. And they reached the highest level on the scale, meaning they were very aware of the pain they inflicted on the subjects or on the subject. The subjects continued with the experiment even though they were suffering from psychological distress, and this is really fatal, or a very important point, I think. And the psychological distress showed itself, for example, through trembling of the hands or muscles. None of the 40 participants stopped the experiment before reaching 300 volts. 14 of the subjects discontinued with the experiment at different points after 300 volts and were thus classified as defiant. Yeah, so I will add some further pieces of information here, add my own thoughts. We need to point out that even those classified as defiant went along with the commands of the experimenter for a relatively long duration of the experiment. When we look at other forms of misuse of power in an authoritarian context, such as the situation we are facing right now in apostrophes, the corona crisis, we may expect to see some level of courage among those who have initially accepted orders to be executed. The execution of orders alone does not exclude extreme psychological distress and regret for the things that have happened. So, meaning although orders are accepted and executed, that does not mean that those people executing these orders, presenting us this information in the media, or carrying out certain functions in our political system, does not mean that they do not suffer from severe psychological distress. And if we look closely, we can even see that in some politicians. Obedient are only those who follow through with all the orders. So based on this information, we may be able to say that there is a way out for those who are just beginning to understand the reality of the situation. It is not an intrinsic, of course, not an intrinsic character flaw of the German population that makes them follow orders blindly, so it applies to people all across the globe. MILGRIM'S experiment shows that most humans tend to react in similar ways when receiving orders from an authoritarian entity. And also important, the situational variable. Extreme situations, the way commands are expressed and passed on to be executed in a crisis, is important in manipulating this form of behavior. And if implemented systematically, any intelligence system that has studied and understood human behavior can exploit it to its own advantage. So I might make another video on this topic, like a follow-up video on the topic of obedience. But yeah, I think you get my message. I hope the right people get this message. We need to inform people of the psychological processes that are at play right now in the political leaders, and the people working for the media, and also of course in those directly affected by these guidelines. Why am I making this video? If I make occult videos, or mainly occult videos, I have an interest in so many things. I'm interested in basic spirituality, not only the occult and left-hand magic, right-hand magic. I have a strong interest in psychology, also in the language sciences. As some of you might know, I'm also a guitar teacher, so I'm a musician as well. I have postgraduate training in the social sciences. And I think here now in this crisis, in order to understand this crisis correctly, and in order to address the many factors that are important to talk about in this global crisis, we need knowledge and information from different fields, and we need to bring these fields, or the knowledge from these different fields, the insights that we gain from these different fields together in order to shape the foundation of a new, stronger system or a stronger form of society. So guys, let me know what you think about it, and I will talk to you soon.